Hey everybody, we're going to get started. Bernie's been up here for a bit. I'm not going to say too much about Bernie outside of that he's inspiring. He's very keen mind. He's been swimming in environmental issues for a really long time. Almost encyclopedic photographic recall of all the major literature of the last 30, 40 years. I'm assuming you'll weave in some of your personal stuff as you go through, or do you want me to say a bit more about anything, or...
Well, I don't know how much of my background you've mentioned to them already.
In the flyer that went around, environmental lawyer, Sierra Club, national vice president. He and I went to Florida together in the Religion and Nature program, so that's where we met. Bernie's now out in Santa Cruz, working on a PhD in environmental sociology, focusing on issues of religion and the environment. He's going to talk today about sort of what's going wrong and maybe what we can do to reverse where we're heading and start bringing sustainability about. So, all you, Bernie.
All right. Thanks, Todd. Thanks for arranging this opportunity to visit the College of Charleston via Skype, if only virtually. I have visited your fair city 6 years ago. Stayed in the Francis Marion Hotel. Isn't that the hotel downtown?
Yep.
And the Sierra Club, I was still on the board, and the Sierra Club had a board meeting in Charleston. And so that was my occasion to get to visit your city. I'm titling my talk, Goodbye Gaia, ? The top 10 reasons we're failing to save the planet and what we can do about it. My intent is to give a global lay of the land, borrowing a phrase from our Sierra Club campaign planning manual, and reflect on the state of the environment from a broad, big-picture perspective, and the health of the environmental movement in particular. I've been thinking about the environment a long time. If I give myself a broad definition of what constitutes thinking about the environment, I can say that I've been thinking about it since I was 3 years old, about as far back in my own history for which I have conscious recollections. My dad, a Connecticut Yankee who had transplanted himself to Los Angeles area in 1952, had found a strange brown haze in the mountain-rimmed Los Angeles basin that seemed to make its way. This was back in the days when the official position was that there was no such thing as air pollution. So when he complained to his physician, he was told that he was probably just imagining it. However, when he drove up one afternoon to the top of Mount Wilson, above Los Angeles in the San Gabriel Mountains, on a particularly smoggy day when his breathing was most painful, he got above that brown haze and found suddenly that his breathing returned to normal and was pain-free. So having discovered the cure for his imaginary ailment, he proceeded to spend much of the rest of his life running away from smog, either by driving up into mountains to get above it, or out into the high desert, where it was also usually smog-free, or at least much less concentrated. Thus, for me, as far back as I can remember, my dad was running away from air pollution and taking me and my mom along for the ride. In the summertime, when air pollution was at its worst in Southern California, these flights were a nightly affair. My dad didn't see any irony in fleeing from smog, he was making more smog. All he knew was that he wanted to breathe freely. For me, the impact of these early experiences was to teach me that our environment was damaged and could be a source of harm. Besides my dad's seeming hypersensitivity to the physical effects of air pollution, I have a personal recollection of biking home from school during my 10th grade year on a particularly smoggy afternoon in 1973. It was a 4-mile bike ride, and when I finally got home, my lungs literally burned, and I had a violent coughing fit for a solid 20 minutes. That was so intense that if you had asked me to simply state my name, I would not have been able to do it. There was a plus to all this. Me out in the wild places at a very young age. and gave me an early appreciation for outdoor splendors of mountains and deserts. This instilled in me a desire to work to save our environment, leading me to make this effort my life's work. I've been actively engaged in environmental activism since 1981. So looking back over the last 42 years since the first Earth Day, how are we doing? I've got some good news and I've got bad news. First, the good news. Clearly, we've made a lot of progress in some areas. The air in a number of large urban areas is cleaner than it was in the 60s and 70s due to auto and power plant pollution control devices mandated by the Clean Air Act. And this improvement has occurred even as the number of cars in California and in the nation has increased about tenfold. In my former home city of Boise, Idaho, where I lived for 17 years, though, the air quality is deteriorating, caused primarily by the enormous population growth in Idaho that it has experienced over the last 15 years, largely as the result of refugees from California, like I was. On the water quality front, more waters are fishable and swimmable than was the case 40 years ago due to the mandates of the Clean Water Act. Rivers no longer catch fire due to flammable pollutants, as was fairly regularly occurred in the 1960s. And thanks to the protections afforded by the Endangered Species Act of 1973, some species that were endangered 40 years ago are in better shape, some so dramatically that they have been removed from the endangered species list, such as the bald eagle. In sum, the good news is that we know how to go about cleaning up the environment, and we have had some success in doing so. Now the bad news. In March of 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was published, which drew on what 22 national science academies from around the world. Walt Reed, the leader of the report's core authors, warned, "The bottom line of this assessment is that we are spending Earth's natural capital, putting such strain on the natural functions of the Earth that the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. The changes in policy and practice required are substantial and not currently underway." So why are we in this predicament? We know what we are doing. We're changing the climate. We are knowingly causing the wholesale extirpation of whole classes of other life forms in one of the greatest extinction spasms to ever hit our planet. Why then are we still headed to the brink of the cliff? Here then is my list of the top 10 reasons that our work has been stymied. Reason number 1, lack of genuine governmental commitment. While we passed some fairly good environmental laws in the 60s and 70s, some of which I've already mentioned, and others like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Wilderness Act, no administration, Republican or Democratic, has truly been aggressive in promoting environmental protection. Instead, administrations have ranged from tepid support to active hostility. Contrary to some opinions in right-wing media, Barack Obama is no environmentalist. I'll return to this reason in a bit. Reason number 2. For the most part, environmental groups, including my organization, the Sierra Club, have only tackled 1/3 of the problem. More than 3 decades ago, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich, famous for his book, The Population Bomb, taught us that the environmental impact of humans is a function of 3 things: our population, our level of affluence, and our technologies. Environmentalists as a movement have tended to focus primarily on wildlands protection through the creation of new wilderness areas, parks, or preserves, and on the technological fixes, such as improved pollution controls and fuel efficiency, and on alternatives to fossil fuels, pesticides, and wood fire. We focused here because it was easier to organize a movement by identifying a villain or group of villains, such as polluting corporations and their bought and paid for politicians, and plan activities against those targets. Indeed, our Sierra Club campaign planning manual advises us specifically to do this. Everybody likes being the good guy going after a bad guy. And as I've already noted, this approach produced some real successes. Population and consumption issues, though, strike closer to home and challenge our very own lifestyle choices, including the choices of many dues-paying members of environmental organizations. As a result, we haven't taken a strong stand regarding our increasing domestic and global population or our high and increasing rates of per capita consumption. Again, it's far more fun to target bad guys out there than to take an introspective look at our own choices and lifestyles, both in regard to our level of resource consumption and our reproductive choices. Nevertheless, at the risk of discomfort, let's look at consumption. A now familiar statistic bears repeating. The U.S. accounts for 5% of the global population, but consumes anywhere from 25 to 40% of its resources, depending on the natural resource, and emits 25% of the greenhouse gases. This is a staggering statistic, and I think most people unconsciously avoid really considering it. This statistic screams out an incredibly ugly fact, namely that the lifestyle we so enjoy living is not sustainable with resources from our own country, and we are sustaining our lifestyle only by mining and stripping the rest of the planet, thereby driving other life forms to extinction, impoverishing cultures elsewhere, and denying future generations of humans, both here and abroad, a livable planet. And if that isn't bad enough, surveys by social psychologists reveal that whether a given household has an annual income of $50,000 or $500,000, they believe they could attain true happiness if only they had twice their current income and could thereby double their current level of consumption. And on the population front, the U.S. continues to grow at the fastest rate of any developed country. In sum, even though we live on a finite planet, our actual numbers and our individual per capita rate of consumption are both increasing, both here at home and globally. Reason number 3, partial success means less public interest. For a long time, the leaders within the environmental movement have considered the problem essentially one of education, or what cognitive scientist George Lakoff calls the facts will set you free approach. Once enough people are informed of the damage we are causing, these newly informed people will spontaneously alter their behavior, and in our democratic society will demand laws that correct the earth-harming behaviors of for-profit enterprises. People are basically good after all and will naturally take the necessary steps to protect our life-sustaining planet. This was a viable hypothesis in the 1970s, when all the various threats were first becoming widely appreciated and understood. Educate people and they'll do the right thing. However, it hasn't worked out that way. The level of public interest in environmental issues has actually declined. Part of the reason for this is something I don't think we anticipated at the first Earth Day in 1970. The very improvements that came with more effective regulation of air and water pollution, the partial cleanup of toxic dumps, the wilderness designation or other protection of particularly popular wild areas, and the recovery of previously endangered popular species like the bald eagle and wolves, means that for an increasing portion of the American public, environmental issues just don't seem as urgent. The Sierra Club is quite successful getting people directly affected by environmental harms engaged, whether it's a proposed nearby incinerator or a new coal plant outside Chicago. But for most people, if it's not happening in your neighborhood, you don't worry about it. It's not on your radar screen. This translates into less pressure on public officials. Reason number 4, out of sight, out of mind. Another reason that environmental problems fall off our radar screen is the global consumption patterns I mentioned a moment ago. For example, we import 60% of our oil. Setting aside global warming effects for the moment, that means that 60% of the real environmental effects of our oil use is felt, not by us here in the US, but by people elsewhere in the world. The same goes for all those resources that we are importing from elsewhere. We import 40% of our wood fiber, mostly from Canada, meaning we don't see all the thousands of square miles of clear-cut lands our wood product use actually creates. Reason number 5. Orwell was off by 20 years. If you've never read George Orwell's 1984, you should. Turns out he was only off by about 20 years. The George Bush administration, George W. Bush that is, was especially adept at Orwellian doublespeak. He proposed a Clear Skies initiative that would have effectively repealed the Clean Air Act by allowing utilities to pollute at current levels for an additional 20 years beyond what is allowed under current law. He proposed and tricked Congress into passing a Healthy Forest Initiative that really just increased incentives to log our national forests while doing little or nothing to increase protection for small communities at risk of wildfire. I won't further belabor the details of his multiple assaults on the environment here. Obama has been an improvement in terms of environmental policy, but only a slight improvement. There is a quip often attributed to Abraham Lincoln that you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Well, as a political principle, the political right in the US seems to have discovered that you only need to fool enough of the people enough of the time. This is a real problem for environmental movement. Many people naturally want to believe what their government tells them and find it hard to believe that their government officials will blatantly lie. Reason number 6, beware of weapons of mass distraction. Recall a time a century and a half ago when people traveled considerable distances by horse and buggy to stand in uncomfortable clothing in the hot sun for 3 hours to listen to politicians debate each other. Can you imagine that kind of attention to important public issues today? How much easier is it to watch TV, catch a movie, play a video game, engage on Facebook, watch YouTube? In the words of Neil Postman's provocatively titled book, we're amusing ourselves to death. We activists who seek greater public attention to and involvement in important public issues are up against some beguiling alternative activities. Those who seek to profit from damaging activities rely on the public's distraction. Reason number 7, postmodern relativism. About 20 years ago, I started noticing a new argument being advanced against involvement in environmental and other social justice issues. It goes something like this. You want to save the earth, I want to make money off the earth's resources. Both views are just opinions, and both are equally without basis. We don't really know anything. Thus, you keep your opinion, I'll keep mine. Most environmentalists don't buy into this kind of relativistic thinking, but I've been surprised by the growing number who do, and it causes them to mute or soften their advocacy efforts. To those who have begun buying into this thinking, and colleges and universities are hotbeds of this kind of thinking, it is unseemly to say that anything is right or wrong. Further, I'm told by college students in the Sierra Student Coalition that this kind of relativistic thinking is rampant and deeply ingrained on many campuses, greatly inhibiting their ability to recruit a new generation of environmental activists. The genesis of this new problem is long and complex, but it's a real problem and a real barrier to environmental advocacy. Reason number 8, my memes are making me do it. At the end of his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, British biologist Richard Dawkins coined a new term, meme, a word that he intentionally fashioned to rhyme with gene. Dawkins defines a meme as a unit of intellectual or cultural information that survives long enough to be recognized as such and which can pass from mind to mind. Relevant to our discussion today, here's an example of an anti-environmental meme. This is a bumper sticker that is sometimes seen in the Boise, Idaho area that was distributed by a local Baptist church. It's a large bumper sticker because it has all of the following to say. Forget save the earth. What about your soul? The earth is going to burn. What about you? The author of this sticker had a different sort of global warming on his mind. Obviously, the author of this bumper sticker and those who display it think my efforts to save this planet are an utter waste of time. God is going to make a new world soon. Why worry much about this one? Here's another bad meme. I should be able to do anything I want with my land and maximize its profit to me, regardless of the effect on the larger community. You get the idea. I'm sure you can think of other examples. Once these bad ideas lodge themselves in the gray matter of individual human brains, they are very hard to get out. And these bad memes create real barriers to environmental progress. Reason number 9 is what I call nature's flaw. Paul Ehrlich and Robert Ornstein hypothesized that humans are affected by a lack of natural selection for a response to slowly developing threats. They explain this reason as follows. Hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, our ancestors' survival depended in large part on the ability to respond quickly to threats that were immediate, personal, palpable. Threats like the sudden crack of a branch as it was about to give way, or the roar of a flash flood racing down a narrow valley. Threats like the darkening of the entrance of a cavern as a giant cave bear enters. Threats like a thrown spear. Those are not threats generated by complex technological devices accumulated over decades by unknown people half a world away. Those are not threats like the slow atmospheric buildup of carbon dioxide from auto exhausts, power plants, and deforestation. Not threats like the gradual depletion of the ozone layer. Thus, the human mind evolved to register short-term changes from moment to moment, day to day, and season to season, and to overlook the backdrop against which those take place. Ornstein further argued that not only couldn't our ancestors detect slow changes in their environment, there wasn't much they could do about them in any event. They either migrated or perished. Perhaps natural selection tended to favor those who didn't even bother worrying about these things they couldn't change. However, since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and especially with the industrial and public health revolutions during the past 2 centuries, we have dramatically altered the evolutionary game plan. We are now capable of and are inflicting enormous damage to the planet, but our Stone Age sensibilities render most of us oblivious and indifferent to this developing catastrophe. Reason number 10. Is it possible that we just don't care? Finally, and perhaps most troubling, is it possible we know what we're doing to the planet, know what we need to do to stop, but just don't want to? If this is true, it's a big problem because people rarely do what they don't want to do. The potential truth of this hypothesis of mine was driven home for me a few years ago when I was giving a presentation on the environmental effects of logging to a high school environmental sciences class in Mountain Home, Idaho. I had made my standard pitch about how we could end the commercial logging of our national forests if we would recycle more than we currently do and begin using alternative building products. In the question and answer period, a young man declared that we won't recycle more and we won't use alternative building supplies, and we just have to get used to the fact that it is human nature to destroy the natural world. In his words, he said, "We are the destroyer species, and there's no point of getting upset about it." I protested and said I was counting on his generation to start doing things the right way. I was stunned by the casualness of his statement and his willing acceptance of its destroyer role. Is that young man correct? Are we the destroyer species? Some scholars think he's right. Garrett Hardin and B.F. Skinner have noted that the evolutionary law of natural selection has ensured that we will pursue our immediate self-interest and that of our immediate offspring. And zoologist Franz de Waal has noted that concern for the welfare of a member of another species is largely unknown in non-humans. And given the indifference of most people to our ongoing extinction crisis, it's a rather rare trait in humans as well. Further, the pioneering work in the area of sociobiology by E.O. Wilson and others has shown that even some types of seemingly unselfish behavior can be selfish in a biological sense. Much of what humans call moral behavior can be seen as selfishly motivated. I agree not to kill you. You agree not to kill me. I agree I won't steal from you. You agree to not steal from me. Biologists call this reciprocal altruism. The restraint I show is primarily for my own self-interest. I agree to restrain myself in return for your showing restraint. I want to return, as promised for a moment, to reason number one, the lack of genuine governmental commitment to environmental protection. Cumulatively, my other 9 reasons help explain the lack of true governmental commitment to environmental protection. As George Bernard Shaw said, democracy is a device that ensures that we shall be governed no better than we deserve. Ultimately, in our democracy, our leaders must ultimately yield to the general will of the majority of the people. If our political leaders are not adequately protecting the environment, it is because not enough of us are demanding that they do so. The question then becomes, are we, through our democracy, giving the earth what it deserves? So with acknowledgement to David Letterman, that's my top 10 list. I'm sure we can all think of others, and publicly stating these reasons is somewhat controversial. I've been challenged for stating them out loud in public. While a few have questioned my analysis, I'm told that I shouldn't state them because they're too depressing. Instead, I'm told we as environmentalists should just talk about part of our platform that we think the public already agrees with. I call this Pollyanna environmentalism. Just talk about the positive instead of doing the hard work of actually shifting public opinion to a stronger, broader environmental ethic. I advocate for the tougher path, hard though it is. We can't make these factors I've described disappear by just agreeing amongst ourselves not to talk about them. Now that I've depressed you enough, are there then any hopeful facts? Another item from the world of biology provides this glimmer of hope. Zoologist Franz de Waal, in his book Good Natured, describes an experiment where a group of rhesus monkeys were placed in common living space with stump-tailed macaques. Stump-tails are easygoing and tolerant, whereas rhesus monkeys have a rigid hierarchy strictly enforced through violent behavior. Over the course of 5 months, the rhesus monkeys took on the more gentle, tolerant behavior of the stump-tails, and then retained those behaviors when once again put by themselves. In other words, the social culture of one species was successfully infused into the group of another species. This success shows that the typical behavior of the rhesus is to some extent culturally learned, as opposed to being genetically innate. The good news is that if our civilization were serious about creating a more earth-friendly human culture, we certainly could. But what will make us serious about creating such a culture before it's too late to save the diverse splendor of our planet that still remains? I frequently ask people, environmentalists and others, for their opinion on this. And the usual response is that nothing much will change until things get worse. People will change when circumstances force them. If this is true, it seems the planet's fate is to suffer ever-worsening despoilation. Jane Goodall, in her book Reason for Hope, suggests that we must all become at least mini saints, each doing our fair share to save the planet. Of course, she's right. That is what must happen if any part of the remaining splendor of our planet is to be salvaged. But is there hope? Is there still time to save the planet? We don't know, and it is impossible to know. Fortunately, this is a good thing. To paraphrase E.F. Schumacher, if we thought there was enough time, we'd become complacent and do nothing. If we thought it was too late, we'd give up in despair and do nothing. In the end, the only way it is hopeless is if we all decide to sit back. I urge you to resist this urge, tempting though it may be. Instead, I want to close by suggesting that the answer to this question of hope lies deep in each of our hearts and the hearts of our friends, families, and coworkers. If we, all of us, environmentalists and otherwise, are willing to come to terms with what we're doing and make a commitment to making the necessary changes that we all know are necessary, then yes, there is hope. May we all make the choice for a better environmental future. Thank you.
Great, thanks Bernie. Questions? We got 17 minutes, so just speak up loud enough so Bernie can hear you. Bernie, let us know if you cannot hear and we'll just repeat the question. Anybody?
I have a question. How would you say the Sierra Club's sense of the wild and treatment of wilderness has changed since Muir's time?
Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Right. So using William Cronin as a lens,
Okay.
How has the Sierra Club responded to the ideas that he explained?
Well,
Or has
Cronin is hard to describe Cronin. He's a critic of wilderness as an idea, while at the same time proclaiming that he too worships in the Cathedral of Wilderness. And I think by and large, within certainly my generation of Sierra Club activists, are certainly still wilderness appreciators, think that wilderness is a bad idea or a good idea, and have not gone as far as an environmental historian I met just a month and a half ago, who loves William Cronin's essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, uses it in her classes. And when I asked her if, based on Cronin's argument, she would favor a world where all wilderness protected areas and all national parks and all national wildlife refuges would be deprotected and have their protections removed, she said, yes, that's what I want. I don't want there to be such a thing as wilderness. I do not want there to be national parks. And I think we should take inspiration from Cronin and realize our mistake in having ever created those things in the first place. So Cronin's idea, and my idea, has been very corrosive. According to his own language, Cronin would not have wanted that outcome. He would not want the meme he created to be taken in that fashion. But he created the meme, and it is out there, and people are interpreting it in a way that says, we now understand that, and Newt Gingrich used this in 1995, was waving William Cronin's piece around in Congress saying, see, the academics have shown us wilderness is bad, we need to get rid of it. You know, I think that to some extent within the Sierra Club itself, Sierra Club leaders have a hard time imagining such a critique even exists. it doesn't really, and therefore it doesn't really affect them. They continue to advocate for more wilderness areas. You know, Obama has designated, you know, 2 new national monuments with a lot of political pressure being generated by the Sierra Club and other wildland advocacy groups. And so, in some sense, I, as an academic who have returned to the academy, you know, after about 20 years in the field of environmental activism, and have come back to the academy where these anti-wilderness tropes are being thrown around, am more aware of ideas like Cronin's than most environmental activists are. The reality is, and it's probably, from my perspective, a good thing, that most Sierra Clubbers have never heard of William Cronin, they've never read him, and it doesn't affect how they go about their business.
Bernie, I have a follow-up question. You mentioned your generation wilderness activists. One of the issues facing most of the students in this room is just getting a job. And also, so if you could discuss maybe similarities and differences between environmental issues and then sort of transitioning into sustainability, which is more, as you know, than just about environmental protection. So do you see similarities and differences between environmentalism and sustainability, and then speaking to the needs of this younger generation?
Well, I don't see sustainability as being divorced from the environment. And indeed, in some ways, it is interesting. There is a discussion. There's a professional society called the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences. It's a relatively young professional society, kind of surprising given how long environmental studies as a interdisciplinary academic course of work. But they founded themselves about 5 years ago, and there's actually a lot of discussion about has sustainability become the new broad category, the new name, really, for what we have for the last 40 years called environmental studies. And it really being just a new label for the same thing. You know, that in sustainability courses, you would be taking lots of biology classes and a lot of geography classes with the usual complement of environmental economics and environmental politics. So the extent to which, you know, sustainability is really something new, or is it really just a new label for what we've been doing for the last 40 years? My sense of the conversation going on within the academy about this is that it's just the new label for an old thing. And maybe we'll close down all of our environmental studies departments and we'll now have sustainability studies. But they'll really be mostly the same thing. To go to your question of jobs, you know, that is a challenge that is primarily a political problem. The lack of adequate jobs is primarily a political issue of the manner in which the 1%, and even more importantly, the top 10th of the 1%, have managed to concentrate society's wealth in their hands at the expense of, you know, the other 99%. That is creating losses of opportunities for jobs. It is creating, you know, perhaps on purpose, that if the financial elite can keep everybody so anxiety-ridden over their own survival and trying to find a job, any old job, that is another way of being distracted from the ultimate issues of the environment. And for whatever reasons, it does seem that, you know, the capitalist elite seem to be unable to grasp the fact that even they need a planet to live on. They are not going to be able to retreat to Mars. And if they could retreat to Mars, they wouldn't like it once they got there. But, you know, I think there is an intentionally cultivated ignorance even amongst themselves. Maybe they believe they're going to be able to monopolize the last remaining habitable parts of the planet up in the Arctic, and they'll be able to create fortresses where they can still survive in splendor and luxury while the rest of us are descending into Blade Runner world. And I think for the most part, I like the Princeton philosopher's Harry Frankfurt's explanation of this phenomenon. And if you haven't read his wonderful philosophical text on bullshit, you should. And he's taken bullshit and turned it into a technical philosophical term. And what bullshit for him is where you just ignore reality. You don't know what's a lie, you don't know what's true, and you don't even care. And so you peddle bullshit to others and you try to believe it yourself. And so I think that the global elite, have slipped into their own trap of believing their own bullshit and haven't been able to figure out that they actually need a planet too.
There have been a number of small victories for the environmental movement in the courts. Do you have any hope for any future development, specifically within the courts and environmental law, like maybe with the litigation with the Deepwater Horizon, for example?
Well, I think most of our environmental victories over the last 40 years have been primarily a product of legal victories. And the fact that, particularly as it relates to the National Environmental Policy Act, which was, signed by Richard Nixon, and the Endangered Species Act, it turns out that based on, progressive judges that we still had in the 1970s, interpreting those laws in a way that had real teeth, has led to the foundation of the environmental successes that we've had. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that John Ehrlichman, who was an aide to Richard Nixon, who went to prison over the Watergate scandal, before he was Richard Nixon's closest aide, he was general counsel to Weyerhaeuser, the timber company. And that when Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act, that he told Nixon, oh, you should go ahead and sign this. It's a little piece of fluff legislation to make people feel good, but it has no real meaning. And that the idea is that John Ehrlichman, competent lawyer that he was, knew that the National Environmental Policy Act had the capacity to be a very powerful law, and that he intentionally deceived Nixon into thinking otherwise, because notwithstanding the fact he'd been a timber industry lawyer, that he was a secret closet environmentalist. Be that as it may, we got NEPA. The industrial interests in our nation have hated that law ever since. They've weakened it in some ways, but it still remains a meaningful piece of legislation and as interpreted by the courts. The endangered species was a similar situation as well. Don Young, still a congressman from Alaska, who voted for the Endangered Species Act, says we had no idea we were, protecting little liverworts that, lived in some little sand dune somewhere. We thought we were just protecting eagles and bears. And I never would have voted for this law. And it creates a hypothesis I have that Congress will sometimes do the right thing by accident. And having done so, will leave it in place. Even if they really understood what the effects of their legislation was, they would not have done it in the first place. But having accidentally done it done something good, and they have left good in place. And I would say that there was kind of a magical period of time from 1969 to 1973 where the new environmental movement was attaching itself to the anti-war movement opposing Vietnam and was able to tap into that activist energy and get these 4 major laws, the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act passed. And most of environmental activism for the succeeding 40 years has been trying to fight off attacks and to keep those laws in place. And for the most part, we've succeeded. At the time, I think every environmentalist that worked to pass those laws knew those laws weren't enough, but thought that we'd get them passed and then we'd move on to other things. And the way it has turned out is that we've never really gotten to move on to other things. We've had to fight like hell to hang on to those victories that we got. But court victories and the implementation of those statutes remain a very key tool. And however, what Congress has given, namely those laws, Congress can take away. And once Congress takes those laws away, the courts will be powerless for the most part.
Bernie, related, do you see any laws coming out about CO2 or carbon trading or anything to offset, limit our greenhouse gas emissions in the near future?
Not in the U.S. Given the political gridlock in Congress, I think that certainly not at the federal level. Let's put it that way. I do think that there are state-by-state laws being passed. The most progressive of which is here in California, AB 32, mandating certain percentages of alternative energy, and California is actually pretty far along the path of trying to reach those targets. So where the politics in a given state are conducive to it, I think we will be able to make some significant progress, perhaps at the state level.
Bernie, a lot of young people on our campus are concerned about that Idaho bumper sticker. And
they're worried about the...
the Cornwall Alliance.
I do.
They probably were funding that publication of that bumper sticker.
Well, actually, when that bumper sticker was in use, was before the Cornwall Alliance had come into existence yet. It was actually just the Treasure Valley Baptist Church, published. The head pastor at that church came up with that bumper sticker, and he produced it. But he captures an idea when Calvin Meisner, the founder of the Cornwall Alliance, who's an Orthodox Presbyterian theologian, he was interviewed by Bill Moyers in 2006, in Bill Moyers' episode called Is God Green?, where Moyers was investigating the rift within evangelical Christianity. And a fairly substantial chunk of that program was Moyers interviewing Calvin Meisner. And Moyers asked Meisner, do you worry that you're wrong about global warming? And Meisner's answer was, yeah, if it turns out I'm wrong about global warming and it's real, I'll be sad about that. But it won't be the first time I'm wrong. And anyway, what everybody should primarily be worried about is whether or not they're going to spend eternity in heaven or hell. That this planet is, in the overall scheme of things, just not that important. So he came right out and said that, in an interview, and basically identifying himself as somebody that, if he wouldn't put that bumper sticker on his car, he certainly thinks it. And there's another bumper sticker. I don't have it handy, or I would show it to you. And there's also T-shirts that can be purchased that have this same sentiment on it, is that global warming is nothing compared to eternal burning.
Third-degree burns.
Third degree?
This is what I tell my students now. No narcotics, third-degree burns in perpetuity. Very nice father we have here, isn't it?
So, you're down in the heart of the Bible Belt. How popular would that Boise bumper sticker be in your neck of the
I'm
woods?
not sure, but I'd like to find out how popular it would be amongst our students. This is one of my concerns.
Have you ever done a poll?
Well, it's a little bit transgressive, I think.
Well, you need to bring.
If I ask them to raise their hands to think that we're in the end times, I can't do that. What do you mean by, and then I ask them, what do you mean by the end times?
Well, Pew did a study in 2006 that asked the question, do you believe Jesus is going to return in your lifetime? And 20% of Americans answered yes to that. So that's at least one measure on a global basis. Todd and I have a colleague that has been doing a lot of focus groups in rural Georgia amongst conservative, evangelical, and fundamentalist churches. And she's encountering that apocalyptic view where she is, having her focus group participants say, young lady, you don't need to be worried about this environment thing. You need to be worried about your soul. And in saying that, feels like they've issued the ultimate answer to the question. It's kind of like, don't you feel silly now that you're worrying about this silly environment thing? And so that, we don't have a lot of social scientific data on how widespread this apocalyptic point of view is. And that's going to be part of my dissertation research, is to try to dig into that.
Bernie, we are over, so gotta get out of this room. Thank you so much for your time. If anybody wants Bernie's email address, you can email me, I'll pass it on if you want to have any follow-up questions or leads on anything he shared. Thank you very much, Bernie.